The story of the RMS Titanic is a story of demographics. It is impossible to recount the events of her sinking without highlighting the differences between first and second class, between passengers and crew, between immigrant and tycoon, young and old, American and British, British and Irish, Protestant and Catholic, men and women and children. Titanic books often have entire chapters devoted to demographics and statistics as if it were the recap of a season of baseball. So you might finally answer that burning question: who had a better survival rate? Third-class American teenagers or second-class widows? One of the most important demographics is, of course, the crew. But you will often hear these 899 individuals lumped together as the crew, one big group with one single story. Well, much like the passengers were split into three classes, the crew was actually split into three departments, three very distinct experiences, three very different survival rates, three very different stories. The deck department, consisting of quartermasters, lookouts, able-bodied seamen, and officers and the like, the men responsible for the ship's navigation. Some saw the collision from on deck, many helped with the evacuation, many were assigned to and manned the lifeboats, resulting in a survival rate of 62.8%, the highest of the three departments, and believe it or not, even slightly higher than the survival rate of first class. The victualling department, saloon stewards, bedroom stewards, cooks, bakers, the men and women responsible for passenger comforts. They weren't informed about anything during the sinking. They sent people on deck or told them to go back to bed, and being that this department was the least likely to have any proper sailing experience, they were also the least likely to be given spots in lifeboats, leading them to the lowest survival rate of the departments at just 19.25%. Most dramatic of all, however, is the one class or department we have yet to hear from on Witness Titanic, the men responsible for the ship's propulsion, the stokers, trimmers, greasers, and engineers that made up the engineering department. Of the departments, this was the youngest. Not youngest by their age necessarily, but it might be that as well, but by concept. Since the beginning of time, ships needed to be navigated, so deck departments existed in some way. And soon after that, passengers would need to be tended to, so the victualling department has a long history. But for hundreds of years, ships were powered by the wind. The engineer occupation didn't even exist. There was no coal to shovel. Less than 100 years before Titanic sank did a steamship even cross the Atlantic. You could also argue the engineering department was the hardest working in terms of environment and physical labor. We're talking about men spending their days in loud and stuffy engine rooms or shoveling coal in steamy boiler rooms that could reach temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns and other injuries were a daily occurrence for these men. And as for the disaster in question, while the deck crew evacuated the ship and the victualling crew sent passengers up to be evacuated by the deck crew, the engineering department was on the front lines of this disaster from the moment it started. They were the only department of the three that were tasked with keeping the ship afloat. No surprise, their survival rate was just under 22%. But much worse than that, if you were on duty in the boiler rooms at the time of the iceberg collision, you had just a 14% chance of surviving. Today on Witness Titanic, we don't just call any old member of the engineering department. We don't just call one of the 7 surviving stokers that were working at the time of the collision. We call one of those 7 surviving stokers who was working in the forwardmost boiler room when the collision took place, giving him the rare distinction of possibly being the first on board Titanic to see water inside the ship and live to tell about it. Welcome, welcome one and all to another episode of the WITNESS TITANIC Podcast, the first inquiry into the sinking of the RMS Titanic in over a century. My name is James Penca, your chairman of sorts, as I conduct interviews with witnesses of her great story, from modern Titanic experts to even the survivors of the sinking. Through their incredible testimony, I hope to bring us closer to Titanic, closer to her passengers and crew, and closer to what actually happened in April of 1912, so that we might all witness Titanic ourselves. Folks, before we dive in, if you like this podcast, if you want us to continue calling witnesses to testify before you, like, follow, subscribe, share, leave reviews, leave hearts, do all the things, whatever you can do to show your appreciation. I promise it does not go unnoticed, and it helps me out a great deal. Also, if you really like this podcast, consider joining our Patreon. Today's witness was actually chosen by our patrons, which is fun, but they also will get bonus testimony from this witness. They already have had the transcript of the testimony for the last week, so they can get familiar with it if they want, which is a new thing that we're doing. Join the fun on Patreon for just $3, $5, or $10 a month, depending on how involved you would like to be. Now, with all of that out of the way, for the first time on Witness Titanic, we leave the U.S. inquiry and hop across the pond to look at testimony given to the Wreck Commissioner's Court, which was the UK equivalent of what we've been looking at over these last 26 episodes. Their investigation had their own set of witnesses, about 97 of them, many of whom had just testified for the Americans, and they came to their own conclusions, which have been heavily criticized over the years for good reason, but that sort of deserves its entire own episode, honestly. But one of those 97 UK witnesses we will speak to today in our own inquiry. He was asked 527 questions, and even after he withdraws, his name is mentioned 46 more times when he's not even in the room, which goes to show how valuable his testimony was. He was also asked 38 questions in the U.S. inquiry, but with almost 500 extra UK questions, I knew it was finally time for us to venture over to the Wreck Commissioner's Court for this episode. So, as the chairman of this inquiry, I now call leading stoker Frederick Barrett to come forward and take the stand. And as a reminder, I am well aware everyone in this conversation should have a British accent, but for your sake, I will keep my British accent to myself. Is your name Frederick Barrett?
Yes.
Are you a fireman? A leading hand?
A leading stoker.
How long have you been going to sea?
I have been going to sea over 10 years in the fire room, but I was on the deck previous to that.
Have you experience of a number of liners?
Yes, I have been in quite a quantity of liners.
And we are off to the races. A quick thought about his title. He is more officially listed and more remembered as a leading fireman. The firemen on a ship like Titanic are the men that shovel coal into the boilers to create steam, to power the engines, to turn the propellers, to push the ship across the ocean. You may be more familiar with the term stoker for this occupation. Both are generally correct, but since Barrett calls himself a leading stoker, that is the term that we will use for him as well. A stoker was paid £6 a month to work for the White Star Line. Not a terrible paycheck for the time, which just goes to show how tough this job was. For reference, This is a better salary than almost every position in the deck department, aside from, the officers, basically. And compared to our previous crew witnesses, Second Officer Lightholler made 14 pounds a month, which would be one of the biggest paychecks on Titanic. But Lookout Frederick Fleet only made 5 pounds a month, and Bedroom Steward Alfred Crawford made just under 4 pounds a month. So shoveling coal in a steamship in 1912, a dangerous job, but not a bad living. And not to mention, a leading stoker like Barrett would make an extra 10 shillings a month, which at the time was an additional £0.5. I have no idea how European money works, but it's a £0.5 in 1912. Don't ask me anything else about it. That's all I know. Now that we've met our witness, let's ask him how the boiler rooms operated. If he's the leading stoker, what sort of crew is he leading? Is there a leading stoker to each stokehold?
There is a leading stoker to each section.
And how many sections are there?
6. One is a single section. There are 5 leading stokers on each watch.
Which was the number of your section?
Number 6.
Does that correspond to number 6 boiler room?
Yes. There are 2 stokeholds to each section. Number 10 and 11 stokeholds is number 6 section.
How many firemen or stokers are there in a watch working with you in number 6?
There are 8 stokers in number 6 section and 4 coal trimmers. That is what they call the men who wheel the coal.
And yourself as well?
Yes, and an engineer.
So some details you may want to know before we move forward. As he said, there are 6 sections. You may more commonly know them as boiler rooms. Barrett also sometimes calls them fire rooms, which I think is really cool. But there is boiler room, fire room, section, whatever, 1 through 6. And while you might think boiler room 1 would be the furthest forward, most of the things on the ship are numbered forward, bow to stern. But these boiler rooms are actually numbered by which is closer to the engine room. So if Barrett says he is in boiler room 6, he is actually the furthest from the engine room, which puts his boiler room as the forward-most boiler room. As he says, boiler room 1, which is right next to the engine room, is a single section, aka it's half the size of the other 5, and it only has a few single-ended boilers. The other 5 rooms have double-ended boilers, which means 2 teams of stokers are working those boilers on the forward and aft ends of them. Each of these groups of men are standing in what is called a stokehold. That's all you need to know. I know it's kind of confusing. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put a map up. And if you're not watching on YouTube, you can go on my Instagram, Witness Titanic Pod. On Instagram, you can see, I'll put a blueprint up of the boiler room so you can just kind of see it. It's easier to see than to describe. Behind the stokers in each stokehold are the coal bunkers. So just to give you a proper visual, if you don't have the ability to look at the blueprints, I want you to imagine each of these big boiler rooms, 2 through 6, are a sandwich. Okay, so in the center is a double-ended boiler. On either side of the boiler are stokeholds with men shoveling coal. Outside of those are the coal bunkers that the men are getting the coal from. And then it's all held together by our slices of bread, better known as Titanic's watertight bulkheads. So if you were to walk through an entire boiler room, you would pass a bulkhead, a bunker, the stokehold, the boilers, a stokehold, the bunkers, then the other bulkhead. Does that make sense? Please go look at a blueprint. Before asking Barrett our next set of questions, let's dive a little deeper into the engineering department, of which he is a very prominent member of. Titanic's engineering crew included on her maiden voyage 325 men. This included 15 leading stokers, like our witness, 159 regular stokers, 73 trimmers, which were the men who wheeled the coal around, so all the firemen, all the stokers had the coal that they needed, 33 greasers who kept the engines in good working order, so Titanic had a long and healthy life, and 45 engine operations staff. This would include all the engineers, electricians, and such. To ensure Titanic continues to steam across the Atlantic, the boiler rooms would need to be manned 24/7 by 5 leading stokers, 48 regular stokers, 20 trimmers, and 3 assistant engineers. This work would need to be done in 3 shifts, so people have time to sleep, which ends up giving Barrett the hours of 4 hours on and 8 hours off. Much better than the deck crew that we've been mostly dealing with, where they only get 4 hours of sleep at a time. The stokers, thankfully, the engineering crew, they get 8 hours off in a row. What a luxury. Barrett would have worked the 8 to 12 watches, so literally 8 to 12 in the morning and 8 to 12 at night, which, of course, puts him in the boiler rooms at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912. I would like to take just a moment to thank Gunter and his book, which I have right here, Guide to the Crew of Titanic. A lot of the information that you will hear in this episode, it is all due to Gunter's incredible research. This is one of my favorite books that I've ever read of Titanic. It's called Guide to the Crew of Titanic. I know I've mentioned it on this podcast before, but just his work breaking down the hours that each person worked. He tries to formulate who was working with who, even when we don't really know. It's a fantastic book. You can see how much money everyone made. It's a deep dive into a subject that doesn't get deep dove into. So thank you, Gunter, for your research. This episode will not be possible without it. Now, being that our witness worked in a leadership position in the boiler rooms, he's a great person to ask about Titanic's speed. Such a topic for these inquiries. Can he corroborate what the likes of Ismay and Lighthauler have told us about the progression of picking up Titanic's speed as the days go by and the hopes of running her at full speed in the coming days? Let's see what he has to say. We know that the fires were lit in number 5, and I suppose in number 6, your section. Were all the fires lit in the ship?
No.
Do you know how many sections were lit?
The first 2 days, when she left Southampton, there were 9 boilers out. The next 2 days, there were 8 out.
When you say they were out, do you mean they were not lit?
They were not lit.
And on the day of the accident, were there 8 boilers not in use?
I could not exactly say about how many were not in use. There were either 8 or 5. I can say sure for 5.
Then as far as you know, there was no reduction in speed.
There were 2 main boilers lit on the Sunday morning, but I could not tell you whether they were connected with the others or not. When you light a boiler up, it will take 12 hours before you can connect it with the others to get steam on, as a rule in a merchant ship as far as my experience goes.
Can you tell me when those 2 or 3 main boilers were lit on the Sunday morning? About what time?
As near as I could say, 8 o'clock in the morning.
Then they may have been connected that same night?
Yes.
So this all sort of lines up with what we've heard to this point. And to add a bit more evidence into the pot, according to another surviving stoker, Alfred Shears, he remembers those 2 boilers Barrett is speaking about. He remembers them being connected to the engines around 7 p.m. the night of the sinking, which lines up, I believe, with what was Beasley telling us in his episodes, that he felt the ship must have been going faster than ever before on the night of the sinking. So everyone's testimony is kind of piecing this together. And to be clear, between Beasley, Barrett, Shears, Ismay, between all these testimonies, it seems pretty obvious that Titanic was going faster than she ever had gone on the night of the sinking. That seems to be absolutely true. But she still was not going full speed, as is so often suggested about the disaster. Speaking of the disaster, let's get into it. Let's ask Frederick Barrett what it was like to witness the iceberg collision from the deepest part of Titanic. Were you on duty at the time this accident happened?
Yes.
Now, can you tell me where you were or what you were doing just at the time the collision happened?
I was talking to the second engineer,
What is his name?
Mr. Hesketh.
Can you tell us where you were?
I was in number 10 stokehold.
Now, just tell us what happened that you noticed.
There is like a clock rigged up in the stokehold, and a red light goes up when the ship is supposed to stop. A white light for full speed, and I think it is a blue light for slow. This red light came up. I am the man in charge of the watch, and I called out, "Shut all dampers."
Shutting the dampers, I suppose, would be...
To shut the wind off the fires. The crash came before we had them all shut. Water came pouring in 2 feet above the stokehold plate, about 2 feet from where I was standing.
Did it come in fast?
Yes.
Did it come in fast enough to begin to flood the place?
Yes.
Then what was it that you did?
Me and Mr. Hesketh jumped into this section, and the watertight compartment closed up.
There were stokers working there still. Stokers in number 6.
Yes.
What happened to them?
There was one of them saved.
One of them was saved.
Yes.
Did he get through the watertight compartment with you?
I could not tell you where he got to.
As far as you know, were any other of your gang saved?
I could not tell you.
As I've already mentioned, if you were working in the boiler rooms during the collision, your survival rate is super low. Of the 53 stokers and leading stokers working at the time, only 7 survived the night. Now, why is this? You may think that, like it is depicted in the 1997 film, that these men were basically entombed into the boiler rooms by the now closed watertight compartments, or that they drowned in the opening minute of the disaster. Fortunately for the real stokers at the time, the movie sort of leaves out a detail that once the watertight doors are closed, they could just climb a ladder out of the boiler room. Not a big deal. And as we see here in Barrett's testimony, only boiler room 6 was sort of flash flooded. The other 5 boiler rooms remained completely dry. So of those 53 men, 44 should have had just as good of a chance at survival as the other 100 not on duty. Only 9 of those men were in Boiler Room 6 and should have had a bigger disadvantage. So why did only 6 stokers survive from all 6 boiler rooms? That's 1 per boiler room. Is it a coincidence? Perhaps because they were on duty, they had to do as Barrett does here in a second and stick around to help while the off-duty stokers can make for the boats. That's probably the best idea. I don't know. We will never know for sure. Now, thankfully, when the collision happened, Barrett was standing in stokehold number 10, which was the aft stokehold in the room. 11 would be the last stokehold, the furthest from the engine room, so it would be the forwardmost. So he's in the aft stokehold in boiler room number 6. So he was able to quickly step into number 5 before the watertight door came down. His description of what he sees in boiler room 5 regarding the damage is very poorly relayed in his UK testimony. So just for a few questions, we head back to our old friends in the States. Do you think it was a large tear?
Yes, I do.
All along the side of number 6?
Yes.
How far along?
Past the bulkhead between sections 5 and 6, and it was a whole 2 feet into the coal bunkers.
So, in case you are still lost, he's saying the iceberg ripped the entire length of boiler room 6, which remember is bulkhead, bunker, stokehold, boilers, stokehold, bunkers, bulkhead. And then in boiler room 5, it only ripped past the bulkhead about 2 feet, so it never got past the coal bunker on the other side. So they even were able to close the bunker door to try to keep the water as contained as they could. I hope that makes sense. Let's get back to the UK testimony. Then what did you do when you got into number 5?
Mr. Hesketh shouted out, "All hands, stand by your stations." That is for the men to stand by the fires. My station was in the next boiler room, and Mr. Shepard and I went up an escape and down to the boiler room, but we could not get in. There were 8 feet of water in it.
When you returned or tried to return to number 6, coming down that emergency ladder, did you see anything of your mates in number 6?
No,
What had become of them?
I cannot tell you, my lord.
Have you seen any of them since?
Only one.
Now, folks, for the sake of time, we are going to skip over quite a bit of Barrett's testimony. For the next hour or so, he simply assists a few engineers in boiler room number 5. Nothing much to write home about, so I'll just summarize what happens, and then we can move on to a part of his evening that is a bit more of interest to our inquiry. Barrett and Shepard return to Boiler Room 5 and find engineers Harvey and Wilson attending to the pumps that might keep the flooding water at bay. Then the engine room orders all stokers to the boat deck. However, Mr. Harvey orders Barrett to stay with him to help. Then the lights in the boiler rooms go out. Terrifying. Barrett is sent to get lamps. He runs up to Scotland Road and sends 2 men aft to the engine room to get the lamps. They do, but by the time Barrett returns with the lamps, the lights are back on, so kind of a waste of time. They then have Barrett collect about 15 to 20 men to pull the 30 furnaces in the room. Once that is finished, those extra men are sent back up. Now, we rejoin Barrett's testimony in Boiler Room 5 with engineers Shepard, Wilson, and Harvey still trying to set up the pumps when things take a bad turn. Then what was the next order?
He asked me to lift the manhole plate off. You lift it off to get to the valves, to turn on the pumps or something.
Is it in the floor?
Yes.
And did you do that for him?
Yes.
That would have left a hole in the floor.
Yes.
And what happened then?
Mr. Shepard was walking across in a hurry to do something, and then fell down in the hole and broke his leg.
He did not notice that the manhole plate had been lifted.
No.
What did you do with him?
We lifted him up and carried him into the pump room, me and Mr. Harvey.
At this time, in this number 5, was it easy to see?
No, all the water which had been thrown on the furnaces when they were pulled out was making the stokehold thick with steam.
Did you stay there after that?
Just about a quarter of an hour after that.
Then tell us, what happened at the end of that quarter of an hour?
A rush of water came through the pass, the forward end. It is a space between the boilers where we walk through.
Now, can you give me any idea whether the water came from over the top of the bulkhead or through it?
I do not see how it could come over the top.
Something that had been holding the water back gave way.
That is my idea, my lord.
So it came with a rush. How fast did it fall?
I never stopped to look. I went up the ladder. Mr. Harvey told me to go up.
You saw in your section Shepard, the engineer?
Yes.
And the last you saw of him was that he had broken his leg and he was taken to the pump room.
Yes.
You have told us you saw second engineer Hesketh in number 6, and you left him in number 5 also.
I left him in number 5 also.
And you saw there also 2 other engineers, Wilson and Harvey?
Yes.
Did you see any other engineers at all?
No.
Did you see any engineers at all on deck?
No.
This may be a good time to remind you all that not a single engineer survived the sinking of Titanic. These 3 men, Hesketh, Harvey, and Shepard, quite possibly never left boiler room number 5. If they did not make it very far. And it is to their specific memory that we dedicate this episode. Now, the story goes that the reason no engineers survived the sinking is that they were brave men who stayed down in the engine room to the very end to make sure that the lights stayed on. Now, my listeners know what I'm going to say. Yes, they were brave men. They were very brave men. But no, that is not what happened. The reality is there were some engineers seen on deck. making for the boats. They were told as a group to abandon their posts and attempt to save themselves. Maybe a few stayed behind a little longer, maybe too long, to help keep the lights on. And they're all heroes regardless, but it's just another exhausting, dramatic retelling of the Titanic that is completely unnecessary. Even the most recent Titanic documentary that just came out, maybe some of you have watched it, they make this the centerpiece of the doc. Now, does it hurt anyone to make their story more heroic? They died. Who cares if we juice history a little and they look really nice for it? Well, what bugs me, like I'm not trying to poo-poo the engineers and say that they weren't heroes or something. What bugs me is that these documentaries and these stories, they're not trying to over-honor the engineers. They are not. They are creating the most interesting story possible, so their documentary does well. They wanted to tell you about a big discovery so you would tune in. Then when they don't have a big discovery to tell you about, they just trot out the same old stories that have been told for the last 100 years. It is not an example of Titanic historians telling the story. It's documentary producers telling the story and lying to sell a product. I'm fine with them trying to make a product out of Titanic. That is what I am doing right now on a much smaller scale. But just let Titanic stand on her own for once. She's plenty interesting. It's like they've gone into a Michelin 5-star restaurant, whatever they're called, and they get their meal and they ask for salt. Don't put salt on an award-winning chef's dinner. It's amazing as it is. Trust the chef. And you know what? Salt is bad for you. And the more that you use it, the more you need it in the future. We literally need to detox from all the Titanic exaggerations out there. And you know what's a really great way to detox from Titanic exaggeration? Witness testimony. Let's dive back in. Now then, Barrett, when all that was over, you told us you came up out of number 5 when the rush came in.
Yes.
Where did you go to?
Up the escape into the main alleyway.
And where did you go after that?
I walked aft.
Did you go up on the deck?
On the saloon deck I went. I called the saloon deck the one under the boat deck.
That is called the promenade deck, I think. Were there people there?
I did not see any. I saw some of the stewards, and there were some third-class passengers, men and women. Number 13 boat was pretty well filled when I got there. There were about 3 more got in after I got in, and the order was given from the boat deck, "Let no more in that boat, the falls will break."
What happened after that?
It was lowered away.
And so from the A-deck promenade around 1:30, 1:40 a.m., Barrett boards lifeboat 13. A pretty quick escape. He just comes up from the now flooded boiler room number 5 and gets in the first lifeboat that he sees. Pretty quick escape for somebody who spent the first 2 hours at the lowest point of the ship. Now, Barrett doesn't mention this in his testimony, but at some point just before this lifeboat is lowered away, someone in the boat calls out for any more women to board, and none come forward. So they holler up to the boat deck for any women on the boat deck to jump down, and a man on the boat deck tells them that there are none up there. So this man on the boat deck is invited to jump down into lifeboat 13. Listeners of this podcast will recall that this man was, of course, Lawrence Beasley from episodes 14, 16, and 18 of Witness Titanic. Isn't it fun when our witnesses cross paths? I actually went back and listened to part 2 of Beasley's testimony, and I jumped to the launching of Lifeboat 13 just to see if maybe he mentions Frederick Barrett at all. And you may recall that in Beasley's testimony, he describes how there was a lot of complications, to put it mildly. When Lifeboat 13 was lowered, there was a discharge of water from the hull. It kind of pushed Lifeboat 13 underneath Lifeboat 15, which was being lowered just a few seconds after. They narrowly avoided catastrophe. And Beasley says in that episode that
A stoker sprang with his knife to the ropes that still held us, and I heard him shout, 1, 2, as he cut them through. The next moment we had swung away from underneath 15.
Beasley actually mentions a stoker cutting their boat free. Could this be today's witness? Let's ask Barrett.
When we found the discharge was coming out, we stopped lowering, and all the hose was tied up in the boat. I had a knife, and I cut the hose adrift and shoved 2 oars over the forward end to shove the lifeboat off the ship's side. We got into the water, and there was a bit of a current, and it drifted us under number 15 boat, and I sung out, "Let go the afterfall." Nobody seemed to realize what I was doing. I walked across the women to cut the fall.
What sort of people were they in her?
5/6 were women, 70 all told. The crew mostly consisted of stewards.
Did you pick up anybody out of the sea or not?
No.
Had you any room to?
No.
Would you consider that boat safe?
No.
How far from the water was the gunwale?
I should say, as a rough idea, about half a foot.
I take it if it had been at all choppy, it would have been extremely dangerous.
Yes.
If it had been bad weather, would it have been worthwhile to get into the boats at all?
No.
So yes, it sounds like it was our witness who appeared in Beasley's testimony, which brings us to our weekly segment, James Cameron's Historic Easter Eggs. If you go back and watch Cameron's 1997 film Titanic, not only will you see a recreation of Boat 15 being lowered on top of Boat 13, but you will also see front and center a stoker cutting the falls with a knife. Is this meant to be Frederick Barrett? Well, this actor can also be seen a few other times earlier in the film, first yelling to the other stokers to put their backs into it. Again, a few scenes later when he yells at Rose and Jack when they're running through the boiler room. And most telling of all, when the watertight doors are being shut, he yells for the rest of the stokers to shut the dampers. So, very clearly, this man is meant to be our witness, Frederick Barrett. James Cameron, once again proving a Titanic nerd can make a good Titanic movie. A few other thoughts on this section of testimony. Barrett says that 70 were in the boat. Unfortunately, it's more likely around 50 or 55, but we can just add this to our already long list of survivors overestimating how many people there are in these boats. I've said this before, but if you know, as Barrett might know by the time he gives his testimony, that the boat he was in should have held about 65 people at full capacity, but you also know that water was 6 inches from the gunwale. In other words, 6 inches from spilling into the boat. If you add 1 or 2 more people, the boat is going under. Why wouldn't you assume that there were 70 or more people in the boat? So while we know the crew, the officers, tend to exaggerate the numbers in the boats, maybe to save their own skin, this is one I'm not so mad about. I also want to point out just this comment that closed that last section. If it had been bad weather, would it have been worthwhile to get into the boats at all? Barrett says no. So can you imagine if it was bad weather? Would these lifeboats wouldn't have, they're in a lifeboat that is 6 inches from going under. If the water's rocky, if there's wind, they're all going under. So bad weather would have made this disaster, would have made the death toll so much higher. But, and I think I've said this on the podcast a few times, there's that sort of weird nature of this disaster where, yes, that's true, but if there was rough weather that evening, they probably wouldn't have hit the iceberg anyway. They would have seen it ahead of time because of the waves crashing at the base. So it is the calmness that caused the disaster, and then it's the calmness that allowed more people to survive. So the worst case scenario would be if the weather picked up in the in-between, and so more people died. But I'm a firm believer of this. If a lot more people die, let's say the weather's really bad and it kicks up around midnight, and all these boats get swamped, and 95% of the people on board Titanic do not survive, I don't think this podcast would exist. I don't think James Cameron would have made a film about it. I don't think the search for the wreck would have been as interesting. A big reason Titanic is the ship that it is in our minds and hearts is because 712 people survived and their stories were told. If 10 people survived, wouldn't be the same. For our final bit of testimony from Frederick Barrett, let's get back into Lifeboat 13 and see how they're doing now that they have successfully escaped the sinking Titanic.
I did not see anybody that was going to take charge of the boat. The rudder was lying in the stern at the bottom, and I shipped the rudder and took charge of the boat until after the Titanic sank.
And then did you take charge of her after the Titanic sank?
No. I gave the tiller to somebody else because I was too cold. I could not feel my limbs. I had only thin gear on coming out of the fire room. Some woman put a cloak over me, and I do not know what happened then.
I gather, Barrett, really, that you felt the cold so much that you do not remember very much.
No, I remember the ship went down.
You remember the ship going down?
Yes. Then I must have fallen asleep.
And with that, the witness withdrew. Thanks to this testimony that you just heard, his incredibly unique experience being in the forwardmost boiler room when the iceberg came sliding by, Frederick Barrett has become a bit of a Titanic legend. He is no doubt the most valuable survivor of the engineering department, but he's up there for most valuable crew member testimony. You know, you can look up interesting facts about the 9/11 attacks. It's often interesting to compare 9/11 to Titanic. They're much more similar than you'd think. But if you look up, for example, that there will be a certain survivor who was at the highest floor for a survivor to come from. In other words, I'm making this up, but let's say there's a survivor who was working on the 105th floor and no one survived above him. So he mathematically survived the worst odds. Barrett, of all the survivors, may have been the first person to get wet during this sinking. That's how close he was to the iceberg when it went by. And let's not forget, he was in boiler room number 5, the closest non-flooded compartment to the source of the flooding, for as late as 1:30 a.m. He may be our survivor who was closest to danger for the longest, at least on paper. Because of this, he is depicted in the 1997 film, as I mentioned, but he's also depicted in so many different Titanic recreations, including the Broadway musical, which people know I like to talk about. And not only is he in the Broadway musical, but he's a main character in the Broadway musical, and he was played by absolute legend Brian Darcy James. And more than all of this, though, Frederick Barrett gets to sing the best song in the show. It is universally agreed. Ask anybody who knows the show, who's like a Broadway person and can, review a musical and know what's good, what's bad. Without fail, The Proposal, The Night Was Alive, that's what it's called, The Proposal / The Night Was Alive, is the best song in the show. And he gets the most beautiful, it's iconic. It is so good, and it all goes to Frederick Barrett. That's really, really cool. And it's such a great song. We will forgive Peter Stone and Mari Yeston for a very large historical inaccuracy regarding Barrett later in the show, but I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen the musical. If you do nothing today in your Titanic journey, please look up The Proposal, The Night Was Alive. I will put a link to the original Broadway cast recording. I will put a link to the song in the description of this episode, this video, everything. Just listen to it. It's like 5 minutes long. Give it a chance. Listen to the whole thing. It's got a really great little twisty ending at the end. Just give it a shot. And if you like it, go back and listen to the whole cast recording. The opening number, it's like 15 minutes long. You get to meet all the characters. It is so good. I am a big fan of that show. So you might as well get on board because you know I'm going to be doing a full episode on the musical at some point. One last thing to point out before we wrap up here that I think is really cool. Lawrence Beasley in his testimony mentions a few Stokers, or maybe it's one Stoker. I don't know. He mentions a Stoker quite a bit in Lifeboat 13. One was very lightly clad, so he was freezing, and he was asleep under the tiller platform. There was a woman passenger who offered him a coat, and he refused it, so they gave it to one of the young women in the boat. There's a bunch of things, and maybe one of these guys could be Barrett, but my favorite story from that lifeboat, the Stoker announced to the group,
"Well, I shall never say again that 13 is an unlucky number. Boat 13 is the best friend we ever had."
And while it's probably not Barrett who said it, because Barrett might have been unconscious, I don't know, given the odds that he overcame to be in that boat, it does sound like something he'd say. Folks, that is it for this Witness. Patrons in the Witnesses tier, they pay just $10 a month. They get bonus testimony from Barrett, and we have a really good chunk of testimony to get into. He's asked in the UK testimony all about that infamous coal fire that apparently sank the Titanic, that you probably heard about in all those awful articles that came out like a year, 2-3 years ago. Barrett, it was the Stoker who was tasked with emptying the coal out to put out that fire. So he knows a lot about that coal fire. So we'll talk to Barrett about what he has to say about that. Next week, I am hopeful I will have a modern witness for you, a very unique witness. We will see if we find a time to link up for the interview, but I'm really excited about it. So fingers crossed there. Thank you to my patrons. Thank you to Titanic Inquiry Project, Encyclopedia Titanica, Ege Erdogan for the theme music, Gunter Babler for that incredible book and his incredible research. As always, subscribe, follow, share, everything, but most of all, be kind to each other, Titanic community. I'll see you again when we reconvene in our next episode and continue our inquiry into the loss of the RMS Titanic.